So largely in any country's economic survey, emphasis is being given on how the economy and its macroeconomic variables have performed in the last 2 to 3 years, particularly last financial year. Now, why there is a need for economic survey and why economic survey is released just before the presentations of the budget? Reasons are very simple. Reasons are that when we are trying to formulate policies for the economy, when we are trying to formulate policies regarding welfare of the society, we need to understand that what is the current economic position. We need to understand that how economic variables are performing and how they have performed in the past. So based on the economic performance and how the economic variables have performed, we can find out the current requirements which the government of India largely thinks about in the upcoming budget for the new financial year. So before presentations of the budget, you know, 1 day before, economic survey is being released. So as a UPSC aspirant, you need to understand that how macroeconomic variables have performed, what are their nature, how based on that nature, how those macroeconomic variables will be in the future, and that's what is overall discussions under any country's economic survey, particularly in context of India. So overall for today, I'll be covering 4 important topics. One is I'll be giving you a review of how Indian economy has performed in 21-22. Apart from it, we'll also be talking about financial or fiscal developments. Second topic. The third topic I'll be taking up is external sector, how our external sector has performed. And fourth, I'll be taking up monetary management and financial intermediation. For today, next Sunday, we'll be taking up 4 more topics also. Now, what we are going to cover under each and every topic, that also I need to tell you before starting the overview of Indian economy. Under overview of Indian economy, I'll be taking up a bit about each and everything, how Indian economy has performed, what are these fiscal numbers, how the banking sector has performed, how agriculture, industry and services have performed. Apart from it, we'll also be discussing about social sector development. We'll also be talking about industry and infrastructure. So that's what we'll be talking when we'll be discussing about overview of Indian economy. Second, under fiscal developments, you know that under fiscal developments, we'll need to focus upon what are our receipts, what are our expenditure, what are the fiscal numbers, what is the debt position of the country. That's what we'll be discussing under fiscal developments. And third, as far as external sector is concerned, I have taught you already what are merchandise, what are exports, merchandise exports, what are merchandise imports, what is merchandise trade deficits, what is trade in services, what are the export in services, import in services, current account balance, capital account position, what is balance of payment position, what is forex reserves, what is external debt. All these things will be talking under external sector. And if we'll be taking the last topic for today, that is monetary management and financial intermediation. Under this, we'll be talking about what are the steps taken by RBI as far as monetary policy is concerned. What are the bank credit, how the banking sector has performed, how the public sector banks has performed, what are their NPA position, what is gross NPA, what is net NPA, what is provisioning. All these things we'll be talking about under monetary management and financial intermediation. And apart from it, I'll also be discussing about something called money multiplier. I have already discussed with you in the class. So for today, this is what I have planned for you all. And next Sunday, definitely 4 more important topics I have planned. So let's take one by one on a very comprehensive note, each and everything which I want to discuss. And this will be these interactions or lectures should not be one way. I want complete interactions with you all, those who have joined with me offline. Understood? So I want complete interaction so that I'm encouraged enough to move ahead with each and every topic. So going ahead, the first important topic is, as you can see also, a state of Indian economy and overview. Definitely each and everything has been taken from economic survey only. These are only summary or glimpse of or glance of what is there in the economic survey, and the overall summary will be getting also, as and when I'll be completing the sessions, all the students, those who are with Unique Academy, all of you will be getting this summary of economic survey also. So what are the challenges with the economy in the last 2 years? No doubt, COVID. So COVID-19 pandemic, and what was the impact of this? The impact of this was on supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruptions. So these are the few challenges which was largely faced by not only Indian economy, but the world economy as well. There were a complete lockdown. Lockdown means it was not physical lockdown, it was lockdown of economic activities. It is lockdown of economic activities. So your demand gets locked down, your supply also gets locked down. So altogether, economy gets locked down. That's what we experienced in the last 2 years. And that's why most of the economies around the world, including Indian economy, contracted, slowed down. Few of the economies went into deep recession also, but we are lucky enough that we were not into deep recession. Our recovery was largely V-shaped recovery. We contracted, but in a short while we bounced back also as and when economy started getting reopened. So that's what was the state of the economy in the last 2 years. Now, what was the major concern for the policymakers in India? The major concern was how to revive these contracts, how to revive the growth, how we can revive, how we can bounce back. And that's why a lot of fiscal stimulus measures were taken by the government in order to revive the economy. In order to manage the contraction, a lot of fiscal stimulus measures were taken by the government. So we'll see how agriculture, industry, and services have moved. If you can see the data related to agriculture, so you can see agriculture grew at the rate of 3.9% in 2021-22 and 3.6% in the previous year. It means, what do these indicates? These indicates a very positive growth rate of agriculture sector in context of India. And I tell you, it was agriculture and rural income which forced Indian economy to bounce back in a very short span of time. In a very short span of time, it was agricultural growth, rural economic growth, which forced Indian economy to grow at a very positive rate. And that's what is the positive side of Indian economy. And that's why I told you that as far as Indian growth story is concerned, agriculture sector is nucleus of it. You cannot ignore agriculture sector because altogether it supports industry as well as services. So agriculture growth was decent, and due to decent agricultural growth, there were rural economy, rural income was very, very high. And when rural income was very, very high, that will create demand in the rural sector also. And that's why you must have seen that most of the e-commerce companies during the lockdown, they have generated larger revenue from tier 2, tier 3 cities. From tier 2, tier 3 cities. So that's what is one of the, that is one of the very positive point about rural economy or agricultural economy. The overall sales, tractor sales, the overall two-wheeler sales in rural India, the overall FMCG performance in rural India, if you see during these years, those have seen a very decent growth. So if fast moving consumer goods segment has increased in the rural area, their overall revenue from rural economy, from rural India has increased. It means, it shows, it proves, it justifies that rural income has rural India has a larger demand even during pandemic, and that's why this statement is justified also when I'm saying that agriculture growth was near about 3.5% in 2021 and 21-22. That shows that must have increased the rural income also, and that is the larger force behind recovery of overall Indian economy also. It means contribution of agriculture sector to the overall economic growth must have been positive. The one sector which was largely hit by pandemic was services, and that too where human contact was there, that part has largely hit. Let's say restaurant services, let's say tourism, let's say other sectors, hospitality, all these sectors in services were largely hit by the pandemic. But then the major push to service sector was by IT and IT enabled services, and that's why in India larger hit was not felt on services, because somewhere or other IT and IT enabled services give a big boost to overall services sector. But as far as informal sector involvement in service sector is concerned, you know that informal sector is largely involved. Why? On what account? Let's say I'm safe working in a restaurant and the restaurant is closed. So what will happen to my livelihood? That's what where most of the laborers, most of the people working in the informal sector has largely been hit, and that's why I told you that one of the key sector which was hit by this pandemic was service sector, wherein human contact was largely important. So there wherein human contact was there, that services have been largely hit. And overall, if you talk about industry also, so definitely there was lockdown. There, no doubt, there will be contraction of industrial activity as well. Out of all this negativity, what was the positive thing about Indian economy? And positive thing was with balance of payment. And our balance of payment was in surplus throughout the last 2 years. So balance of payment was in surplus. I'll tell you the overall story of why balance of payment was in surplus. Reasons brings our dependence on imports completely reduced. Dependence on imports completely reduced. So there at that position we were in deficits. Agar aap current account balance ki baat karenge, so we were into deficits. It means our exports were less, imports relatively were high. But during those times also there were larger inflow of FDI and FPI, and that's what neutralized the impact of current account deficits. And that's why due to those reasons our balance of payment was in surplus. How do we calculate balance of payment? I have already taught you. Current account balance, capital account balance, errors and omissions. That's what will give you balance of payment surplus or deficit position or not. So what I'm trying to tell you, on current account positions where we were into deficits, but deficits were not too high. Imports were high, slightly high as compared to exports, but then that deficit was also compensated by huge inflow of capital either through FDI or through FPI, and that resulted into overall balance of payment surplus. So in the last 2 years we were having balance of payment surplus, and out of this, another good or positive point about Indian economy was that huge foreign exchange reserves. We crossed $600 billion of foreign exchange reserves, and that was one of the positive thing about Indian economy. Overall, what is the situation last year? What was the situation of Indian economy last year? Agriculture on a very positive note, agricultural growth on a very positive note. Services largely hit where human contact was there, but then IT and IT enabled services help it out. And on industrial part, 2020-21 was very pathetic for industrial activity, but slowly and gradually, as and when lockdown started easing down, industrial activity also progressed, and slowly and gradually we moved on the path of overall recovery. So this was the state as far as agriculture industry services is concerned. And when we talk about external sector, so definitely for the last 2 years we have experienced balance of payment surplus with a forex reserves of near about $600 billion. Now you can see the figure, and that's what I'll tell you. What do you mean by demand side of the GDP and its components? In the class, I must have discussed with you a particular formula, which I always tell you that this is my one of the most one of the formula which I like most, and that was y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus a. That's what is demand side of the GDP, and that's what has been mentioned here also. So total consumption, gross fixed capital formation. I have taught you that gross fixed capital formation is nothing but investment. Exports and imports, and that's what get combined together, that will give you overall GDP. So Y was nothing but GDP. So here total consumption was 5.9, contracted in 2021. क्यों contract हुआ? You know the reasons. Consumption क्यों contract हुआ भाई? Contract हुआ due to lockdown. I was not having any income. So, there was uncertainty towards my job. That's why I reduced my consumption. That's why overall consumption has been contracted or not. In 21-22, again, the first advanced estimate says that consumption started increasing, and that's what it is a good sign for any economy or not. See, in any economy, if consumption demand is increasing, that will encourage investors to invest. So there should be consumption demand in the economy, or consumption demand जैसे होता है ना, so automatically investors are induced to invest. So let's see the total consumption numbers. In 1920 it was 5.9%. 0.7.3, it means contraction as far as consumption demand is there. 21-22 7%. एंड 1920 का हम अगर देख रहे हैं रिकवरी, तो जो एनुअल रियल ग्रोथ है दैट इज 99.2%. सो विल नॉट लुक एट दिस फिगर. अगर आप लोग देख रहे हैं कि टोटल कंजम्पशन में गवर्नमेंट कंजम्पशन एंड प्राइवेट कंजम्पशन कितना है, तो देखिए 7.9, 2.9, 7.6. इट मींस इन 21-22 गवर्नमेंट कंजम्पशन हैज आल्सो इंक्रीज्ड, एंड एट द सेम टाइम private consumption has also increased. C plus G. समझ में आ रहा? C plus G. C क्या था? Private consumption. G क्या था? Government expenditure. That overall will make total consumption. If we'll add gross fixed capital formation, so that will be I, and C plus G plus I, X exports, M imports. So exports minus imports will be net exports, and that will determine your GDP. So how we'll be analyzing this data for 21-22, that total consumption has been very positive as compared to the last year. Gross fixed capital formation देखिए 2021 में that was negative. मैंने बताया ना, पैंडेमिक में जब लॉकडाउन था, कॉन्ट्रैक्शन हुआ इंडस्ट्रियल एक्टिविटी में, और बट 21-22 में क्या हुआ, that we started recovering, and that's why it is 15% से ग्रो किए हम. और एक्सपोर्ट्स कितना ग्रो किया? 16.5. इंपोर्ट्स कितना ग्रो किया? 29.4. अब बताइए एक्सपोर्ट ग्रो किया 16.5, 29.4 इंपोर्ट्स ग्रो किया, सो देयर विल बी डेफिसिट, देयर विल बी चांस ऑफ डेफिसिट और सरप्लस deficits. What type of deficits it will have? Trade deficits. What will have? Trade deficits. Understood? So this is what I mean overall demand side of GDP. Demand side of GDP. Understood? Demand side of GDP means Y is equal to C. C means consumption demand. I investment, export demand and imports. Understood? That's what will determine GDP of the country. Similarly, these are share of sectors in nominal GDP percent. If we talk about private consumption, largely contribute to overall nominal GDP. Private consumption का मतलब individual households consumption. Individual household consumption 60.5% contribution है, and that's what is good. Net export देखिए, that is minus 2.5. Next export minus 2.5 है, it means that will signify, that signifies deficits. That signifies deficits. Three important strategy which I'll be discussing about and which is largely mentioned in economic survey is barbell strategy. Second one is agile framework, and the third is waterfall strategy. That's what I'll be discussing with you so that you can understand this important strategy. Now, what do you mean by barbell strategy? Largely, this term or this strategy is largely used in financial markets. And you know, in financial markets, there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of speculation involved also, because we do not know how the financial markets will move, whether it will be in favor, whether it will be against. अगर आप last 3 days का developments देखें in Indian stock market or Indian capital market, then you will come to know that 3 दिन पहले everything was good with capital market. Largely बहुत ज्यादा volatility नहीं थी, but from the last 3 to 4 days, what you can experience that there is larger volatility, and the overall market capitalization has been wiped off to a larger extent. So this volatility is very uncertain. Nobody can predict what will happen. So barbell strategy is largely applied in financial market where there is larger uncertainty involved. Larger uncertainty involved, and it talks about two important things. It talks about number one, the first important point as far as barbell strategy is that to provide safety nets. Safety nets to whom? Safety nets to those who are largely vulnerable, which larger at the lower strata and which cannot bear the consequence of this particular uncertainty. So barbell strategy government क्यों ऐसा सोचती है barbell strategy के बारे में? तो barbell strategy क्या होता है? That provides safety nets to those vulnerable sections of the society who cannot bear these kind of volatility or uncertainty. So government need to provide something to those sections, to those vulnerable sections which are largely which can be largely impacted by these uncertainty. So the policy making of the government is to ensure that these vulnerable sections need to be protected, and that's what during pandemic and afterwards government has tried its best in order to take care of them. Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, increasing the allocations of Manrega, providing cash incentives to the widows, to the poor women. What was all? Providing safety nets to the vulnerable sections, and that's what barbell strategy largely fits into. Understood, all of you? Barbell strategy आपको समझ में आ? Did all of you understood barbell strategy? See these. I'll discuss with you. Generally, what these strategies largely are based upon the name of the economist who comes out with such strategy. Understood? So what happens in case of barbell, you need to understand the meaning. यहाँ पर meaning simple क्या है whenever there is whenever there is uncertainty, whenever there is volatility, so the government need to ensure the safety of those sections which will be largely impacted by this uncertainty, and they cannot bear the impact of this uncertainty. So in a welfareistic society, who will take care of them? Definitely government with its policy making. And that's why I told you in the last 2 years government has come out with lot of relief measures for the lower strata, whether you say Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, whether you say increasing the allocations of Manrega, whether you say other cash incentive method being devised by the government of India. They have done a lot in the form of these welfareistic measures, and that largely fits into what I'm trying to talk about, Barbell strategy. What do you mean by agile approach? Quickly, fast. Dekhiye, in any economic situation, the uncertainty, when you want to control it with your policies, you need to act fast. In a volatile market, you will not get enough time to take care of those who will be impacted by those volatility. So what is this agile approach? This agile approach of the government of India is something wherein there is larger uncertainty. So when there is larger uncertainty, when there is larger volatility, so definitely the government need to come out with various policies and schemes so that the impact of those volatility is not felt across larger sections of the society, across larger sectors. In order to understand it better, tell me if you can overview the economy in 1960s, 17 and 80s, the Indian economy was not that connected with the world economy. So when you are not that much connected, so the impact of anything happens around the globe may not hit you, may not bother you, may not impact you. But as and when you start getting connected, as and when you start getting interacted, I always say, nazdikiyan badhti hain to problem badhte. But it does not mean isolation is the solution. It does not mean that isolation is the solution. Isolation is not the solution. As an economy, we cannot have competitive advantage in all the goods and services. So directly or indirectly, each and every economy around in the globe are dependent on others. But at the same time, we should take measures in order to reduce this dependence to the larger extent what we can, and at the same time we need to be fundamentally strong so that any uncertain developments which take place in any corner around the globe should not influence us largely. So 1960s till 1990s, if you can assess the economy, you will find that global developments and with Indian economy was not that integrated as it is now. See, the integration can be seen. A company registered in USA has its manufacturing base in China, producing in China. Market is not China, market is India, Asia and Africa. CEO hails from Europe, CFO of the company hails from India, and COO hails from some other country. Now see, such is the integration as far as economies are concerned. So at this, whenever there is larger concern, there will be larger chance of volatility, which was not there prior to 1980, prior to 1990, that was not there. But after 1990, not only Indian economy, but other economies of the world have largely integrated, connected with each other. And when there will be larger connections or integrations, so definitely if there will be something happen in one part of the world, the impact of this will largely be felt on other corners also. And that's what we can see, that India has nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine, but don't you think the global supply chain disruptions is hitting us also? Don't you think that Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Maldives, Nepal is largely in the, in a position where they are on the verge of defaulting, and India is completely locked by those economies. So don't you think, India, India has nothing to do with those economies, but developments there, crisis there definitely is going to hit Indian market also, is going to hit Indian economy also, simply because we are connected directly or indirectly. So in such a situation, agile approach comes into picture. Agile approach, you cannot ignore agile approach, simply because unless and until we act swiftly, unless and until we act fast, we'll not be able to manage such volatility, which is not caused by us, but those volatility is because of some other economies. So this is why, the last 2 to 3 years, post pandemic or during pandemic, the government understanding that pandemic, nobody can predict the nature of pandemic, nobody can predict the nature of impact of pandemic. So if we go by the traditional strategy of managing the economy and coming out with different development programs, so that will not work in a country like India. So that's why they come out with something called agile approach. So what does this approach talks about? This approach talks about that in the midst of uncertainty, we do not know what will happen tomorrow. So definitely whatever policies makers will have, will be continuously monitoring the situations, will not be monitoring and formulating policy for 1 year or 2 years, but will be, formulating policies for short term, for 1 month, for 2 months, depending upon how the economy and its fundamentals are behaving due to developments in some other parts of the world. And that's what agile approach comes into being. Understood, my dear? See, in economic survey 21-22, agile approach is largely focused. Even the central theme of economic survey 21-22 is agile approach. See, some of the principles of agile approach has been mentioned here. It is something called customer satisfaction, collaboration, adapting to change, feedback loops, breaking project silos, etc. Understood? That's what is some of the principles of agile approach. Now, what is waterfall approach? In 1990s, I was talking about that as an economy, we are not that much connected. We were not that much integrated. So not only Indian economy, the other economies of the world used to follow, waterfall approach. इसमें क्या होता था? Detailed analysis होता है issue का, उसकी detailed planning होती थी, और फिर उसका क्या होता था? Proper implementation होता था. That's what used to happen under 5-year plans or not? 5-year plans में ही होता था ना. तो that's why क्यों उसमें success हो पाता था ये approach? Because uncertainty we are not that much to that extent. Uncertainty we are not that much. Why uncertainty was not that much? Because we are not totally connected. We were not totally integrated. आज मैंने आपको जो स्टेटमेंट दिया हिंदी में, आज बताओ, आज कनेक्टेड है, आज इंटीग्रेटेड है, तो प्रॉब्लम तो होगा ना. बट फिर से मैं बोल रहा हूं, क्या आइसोलेशन इसका सॉल्यूशन है? नहीं, आइसोलेशन सॉल्यूशन नहीं है. सॉल्यूशन क्या है? वी नीड टू मेक आवरसेल्फ फंडामेंटली स्ट्रांग. जो हमारे पॉलिसीज होने चाहिए अब 5 इयर्स के नहीं होना चाहिए. हमारे पॉलिसी जो बने, जो प्लानिंग हो हमारी शॉर्ट टर्म हो, सो दैट इट शुड टेक केयर ऑफ टुमारो, डे आफ्टर टुमारो, not a month, not 2 months, not 3 months. So there need to be a micro planning as far as management of variables are concerned. And that's what waterfall approach is not, relevant today in a situation of this uncertainty. waterfall approach may not be that successful, and that's why Indian policymakers have shifted from waterfall approach to agile approach.
In some sectors.
Now coming back to fiscal developments. Coming back to fiscal developments. Now, when overall approach is agile, so fiscal approach will be based on agile approach only. Because I'll tell you why. Whenever any economy contracts too much and the private investors' confidence are very, very low, consumer confidence are also very, very low. So neither investors are having positive nor investors are positive. So at the same time, who will take care of the growth? Government intervention becomes important. So government policies need to be based on agile principles. And when we are talking about government policies, no doubt that will become part of fiscal policy. So government, how the government will be investing, which are the key areas where government will be focusing upon. If you'll be talking about 21-22 budget and 22-23 budget, the capital expenditure of the government of India has increased to a larger extent. And when I'm talking about increasing capital expenditure has taken place, so increasing capital expenditure no doubt will have positive influence on GDP growth. And when India is aiming to have $5 trillion economy, either by 2025 or 2030, it need to invest larger extent, and that's where government is contributing largely. And when government, which I mentioned you, that in 2021-22 budget, 22-23 budget, the larger thrust is on capital expenditure. It means the government is trying to invest in infrastructure. So definitely when infrastructure investment will take place, that will lead to employment and output, that will lead to increase in GDP growth. So when we talk about fiscal developments, so larger focus is on capital expenditure. Larger focus upon capital expenditure. For you all, for a pre-question, those who are attempting this year, you need to, you need to mug up all the facts and figures regarding national infrastructure pipeline. You need to mug up all the provisions, information regarding national infrastructure pipeline. Understood? Because there, pre-questions based on the provisions of national infrastructure pipeline can be asked. Now, a particular term you can see, multiplier effect. Can you see multiplier effect in the last paragraph, in the last line of the paragraph? This is where multiplier effects. I'll tell you. In the last 2 years, when we are moving out of this pandemic, as I told you, the government is largely focusing on infrastructure investment. So this pertains to railways, this pertains to roads, this pertains to urban transport, this pertains to power, telecom, textiles, affordable housing. So all these becomes part of infrastructure investment. See, these infrastructure investment leads to multiplying effect on the economy. It means if I am investing 1 rupee, so the impact on the GDP growth or economic growth will be more than 1, will be multiple of 1. It can be 2, it can be 3, it can be 4. And that's why the government thrust in the last year's budget or in 22-23 budget was largely on, infrastructure. Now, this I have marked red for you all to focus upon. See, when the economy started opening after the pandemic, see, overall, both the direct tax and indirect tax, India saw a larger revenue receipts, and that was contributed by both direct tax as well as indirect tax. If you can see today the contribution of direct tax and contribution of indirect tax, so you can see more or less both are contributing comparatively, 50% approx in overall total revenue receipts, and that's what is a good sign for any economy. Before 1991, if you can analyze, then you may find that indirect tax contributed largely to overall tax revenue. But after 1990, the way economy has moved, the contribution of direct tax to the overall revenue receipts has increased. And not only this, with the rationalization of indirect tax in the form of GST, the revenue collections through GST, and that is largely indirect tax, has also increased. And as on date, both the taxes, direct and indirect tax, are contributing largely near about 50% to the overall tax revenue. And that is good sign, because your direct tax and indirect tax both are contributing to overall tax revenue. The second important point regarding direct tax, I have mentioned corporate tax. You know, corporate tax is levied on the profits of companies. Corporate tax is levied on the profits of companies. Now, the corporate tax has contributed largely to direct tax. Corporate tax is a part of direct tax or not? Yes. So when corporate tax will increase, definitely that contribution to the direct tax will increase. And why the corporate tax in the recent years have increased? Number one is that our economy is formalized. Our economy is formalized. What does this mean? In any developing economy, most of the goods and services are being produced, and those are being produced in informal sector. And many times, the goods and services being produced in informal sector may not be accounted as a part of, may not be accounted as a part of GDP. But as and when your economy becomes formal, organized, so whatever goods and services are being produced there, that becomes part of GDP, that can be accounted. So when that is, their contribution is accounted, so they'll be liable to pay taxes. So the reason why the corporate tax has increased, simply in the recent years, the way the economy has performed, the profitability of companies have increased. So definitely they will be contributing larger to the overall tax revenue. Apart from it, the economies are becoming formal. So definitely their contribution is now largely accounted. So they are now liable to pay tax also. And the third important improved compliances due to reforms in taxation. See, the government has come out with a lot of schemes like faceless appeal scheme, faceless penalty scheme. समझ में आ रहा? All these schemes have done wonders as far as tax administration is concerned, and that's what are the biggest reforms in direct taxation. Earlier, most of the income tax officers, they used to meet physically with the people, clients, and there were a lot of corruption issues also. But now, with the coming out of faceless appeal, faceless, penalty, definitely there is no physical interactions. All these things are being done virtually, wherein people are also being encouraged to resolve their issues regarding any taxation, and that also has led to increase in overall tax revenue. Understood? So these are all developments which have been done as far as direct tax is concerned. और indirect tax GST के context में क्या मैंने लिखा है, बाइंड GST. बाइंड टैक्सेशन मैंने आपको बताया है ना, बाइंड GST क्यों बोला गया है? The reasons why here GST becomes bind. टैक्सेशन कभी भी बायंसी होती है टैक्सेशन में कि जब आपकी जीडीपी ग्रोथ बढ़ती है और जीडीपी ग्रोथ बढ़ने के साथ साथ दी कंट्रीब्यूशन टू दी ओवरऑल टैक्स रेवेन्यू आल्सो इंक्रीज, सो वी से दैट any form of taxation is bind. Here also, after the lockdown, the way economy open and the way economic transactions increase, we each and every time we got the record GST collection. Simply the record GST collections was seen because these economic activities started taking place. When economic activities have started taking place, definitely that would have contributed to GDP, and at the same time that would have contributed to GST collections of the government also. And that's why with the increase in GDP, contribution to GDP, there is contribution in GST collections or not. That's what makes GST to be buoyant. That's what makes GST to be buoyant. Those again non-debt capital receipts. What are the debt capital receipts? Debt capital receipts are market borrowings. That's what I have taught you now. Debt receipts are market borrowings, and apart from debt, apart from market borrowings, what is left is becomes non-debt. What becomes non-debt? Non-debt capital receipts में एक part है asset monetization strategy, and as a student, you need to, those who are going for pre, you need to mug up, you need to learn all the provisions, all the points under asset monetization strategy. Understood? So this is the point which I mentioned. Those who are going for pre, either this year or next year, please focus on asset monetization strategy. What is this strategy all about, and what government wants to do with this? Now coming back to the expenditure policy, I was also mentioning with you that the government focus on food subsidies, and that's what Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, and capital expenditure directed towards infrastructure intensive sectors like roads, highways, railways, housing and urban affairs. That's what were the government expenditures as far as 21-22 is concerned. That's what already I have discussed with you all. So under fiscal developments, how we'll be analyzing? Sir talked about revenue receipts. Sir talked about revenue receipts. I told you that contribution of direct tax and indirect tax have increased, and at the same time GST becoming bind. So that altogether is good for revenue side. Second part is, as far as non-debt capital receipts are concerned, government is focusing upon asset monetization strategy. That is also one of the way to generate capital, so that government can invest in capital expenditure. As far as expenditure side of the government is concerned, in the last 2 years, government has spent a larger amount in food subsidies, and I told you also, I told you that Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, under that free food grains were being provided to the near about 60 to 70% of the population, and that's what is one of the food subsidy wherein government has spent a huge amount of money, and apart from it, capital expenditure. This is all about revenue and expenditure, and once we are done with revenue and expenditure, next will come deficits. See how the deficit numbers are. So in 2021, what was our fiscal deficit? 9.2% of GDP. 9.2% of GDP. ये कितना है? 9.2% है आपका एक इफेक्टिव आरडी कितना है 7.2%। इफेक्टिव आरडी क्या होता है रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट्स माइनस ग्रांट्स टू स्टेट्स फॉर क्रिएशन ऑफ कैपिटल एसेट्स। इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट्स क्या होता है रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट्स माइनस grants to states for creation of capital assets. That has been taught to you or not? That is revenue deficits. Sorry, this is primary deficit. Primary deficit is 5.8% of GDP. Primary deficits, what I have taught you, primary deficits के बारे में मैंने आपको बताया है. That is nothing but fiscal deficits minus interest payments. Fiscal deficit minus interest payments. So all these things have been discussed to you. I mean, as far as conceptual understanding is concerned. Now, talking about fiscal deficits, 9.2% is not sustainable for a country like India. But then, ये क्या था? Temporary था. We all know the reasons why fiscal deficits has increased. So in 2021, अगर fiscal deficit 9.2% था, so the reasons are obvious. Reason यही था कि government was forced to spend on various welfare measures wherein revenue side of the government was not there because economy was completely locked down. So definitely I mean fiscal deficit is bound to go up और इसीलिए 2021 में हमारी fiscal deficit कितना थी 9.2% of GDP और ये हमारी प्राइमरी डेफिसिट थी और ये हमारी क्या थी आई मीन 7.4 हमारा क्या था इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट। अब देखिए यहाँ पर एक चीज एनालिसिस आपको करना है कि अगर 5.8% आपका प्राइमरी डेफिसिट है सो व्हाट डज दिस मीन दिस पर्टिकुलरली मींस दैट मार्केट बोरोइंग्स हैव बीन वेरी हाई इन द रिसेंट पास्ट या फिर इस ईयर में या इसके पहले मार्केट बोरोइंग्स हुए होंगे दैट्स व्हाई योर प्राइमरी डेफिसिट इज 5.8%। बट देन 21-22 में तीनों फिस्कल नंबर्स आपको क्या डेफिसिट नंबर्स क्या मिल रहे हैं इज गोइंग डाउन और नॉट व्हाट आर दिस अगेन इंडिकेट्स this indicates that as and when economy started getting recovery so definitely India control its deficit numbers and that's what is a good sign as far as any economy is concerned। but even though we are now 21-22 our budgeted estimation was 6.8% of GDP that also is not very sustainable and definitely in the near future government will try to bring it down। understood? Is it fine? Is it okay with you all? There is a particular term called EBR, that is extra budgetary resources. This is very important. You need to understand this. Extra budgetary resources. What does this means? If you go by the budget documents of the government of India, so this is largely mentioned EBR, extra budgetary resources. What do these means? These are, you know, government of India has certain financial sector undertakings. So if those if those public sector undertakings are spending any amount of money, if they are borrowing from any source, so the repayment, the liability of which either in the form of principal or interest is paid by the government through budgetary provisions. So there are different public sector enterprises or not. So even if those public sector enterprises are borrowing from any other source, the principal and interest of which is going through बजटरी प्रोविजंस। उसके कहां प्रोविजंस आ रहे हैं बजट में। वो देखिए वो फिस्कल डेफिसिट्स के पार्ट नहीं होते हैं, वो ओवरऑल गवर्नमेंट की लायबिलिटीज के पार्ट होते हैं। वो फिस्कल डेफिसिट्स में काउंट नहीं होते हैं, वो ओवरऑल गवर्नमेंट के लायबिलिटीज के पार्ट होते हैं। सो दोज आर कंसीडर्ड टू बी एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्सेज। मैंने लिखा है कि एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्सेज आर दोज फाइनेंशियल लायबिलिटीज दोज आर रेज्ड बाय पब्लिक सेक्टर एंटरप्राइजेज for which repayment of entire principal and interest कहां से जाता है भाई गवर्नमेंट। समझ में आ रहा, बजट से जाता है। उसी को हम क्या कहते हैं EBR, उसी को हम कहते हैं EBR। देखिए याद रखना प्री में क्वेश्चंस वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट है। एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्सेज, द प्रोविजंस ऑफ एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्सेज आर नॉट पार्ट ऑफ फिस्कल डेफिसिट कैलकुलेशन। मैं अगेन रिपीट कर रहा हूं, द प्रोविजंस ऑफ एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी borrowings are not part of fiscal deficits calculations, but जैसा कि मैंने बताया कि those are added to the total debt of the government। तो एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्स पता चलेगा क्या होता है। एक्स्ट्रा बजटरी रिसोर्स, any public sector undertaking when they borrow from any sources, so the principal or interest are paid by the government of India through its budgetary provisions, those are extra budgetary resources। लेट्स टॉक अबाउट रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर। देखिए रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर में क्या क्या आता है, मैंने आपको बताया है ना कि व्हाट आर द कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ, व्हाट कैन बी द कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर। रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर के कंपोनेंट्स क्या क्या होते हैं भाई, इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट भी होते हैं कि नहीं, पेंशन होते हैं कि नहीं, सैलरीज होते हैं कि नहीं, डिफेंस सर्विसेज होते हैं कि नहीं, सब्सिडीज होते हैं कि नहीं, लॉ एंड ऑर्डर एक्सपेंसेज होते हैं कि नहीं। तो दीज आर ऑल बिकम्स पार्ट ऑफ रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर। अब रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर में आप देखेंगे तो ये कंपोनेंट्स है, इन लैक्स करोड़ है ये। तो आप देखिए कि इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट, देखिए इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट 21-22 में सबसे ज्यादा है, दैट इज 8.10 लाख करोड़, 8.10 लाख करोड़। अंडरस्टूड? ये देख रहे हैं आप कर्सर, 8.10 लाख करोड़ है। रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर टोटल है 29.29 लाख करोड़, 29.29 लाख करोड़ है। सब्सिडीज 3.35। यहां पर देख रहे हैं 2021 में सब्सिडीज के कंपोनेंट बहुत ज्यादा बढ़े हुए हैं कि नहीं, ये देख रहे हो कि नहीं एनालिसिस। अब तुमको समझ में आ रहा व्हाट आर द रीजंस व्हाई सब्सिडीज वर देयर। फूड सब्सिडीज कंपोनेंट्स वर वेरी वेरी हाई। फ्यूल सब्सिडी नहीं, क्योंकि इंपोर्ट तो हमारा लॉकडाउन एक्टिविटीज थे, तो गवर्नमेंट अब ज्यादा तो सब फ्यूल पर सब्सिडी देती ही नहीं है, तो लार्जर सब्सिडीज कहां गया हो, फूड सब्सिडी। तो दिस इज द रीजन व्हाई यहां पर तुमको कितना नंबर दिखाई पड़ रहा है, 6.90। देखो दिस आई मीन इस चीज को एनालाइज करो किसी कंट्री में। रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर बढ़ रहा है, दैट इज ए गुड साइन, और कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर बढ़ रहा है, दैट इज ए गुड साइन। दैट्स गुड। कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर बढ़ रहा है तो दैट इज ए वेरी वेरी गुड साइन फॉर एनी इकोनॉमी। अब देखिए मैंने आपको ऑलरेडी बताया कि नहीं, 2021 से जो हमारा कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ रहा है कि नहीं, सीधी ग्राफ, सीधी ग्राफ। यू कैन सी how the capital expenditure has increased and how the revenue expenditure has reduced. This is a very very good sign, and that's why I thought that I should show you this diagram where you can directly see that for any developing economy largely, as I will explain to you also, that revenue जो expenditure होता है, जो क्या होता है largely आपका revenue expenditure जो होता है consumption based expenditure होता है, that does not lead to productivity। बट कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर क्या होता है, इन्वेस्टमेंट बेस्ड होता है, एसेट क्रिएशन होता है, एंड दैट लीड्स टू एम्प्लॉयमेंट एंड आउटपुट जनरेशन, एंड दैट्स व्हाई दैट इज ए गुड साइन फॉर एनी इकोनॉमी। सो आउट ऑफ टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर जो शेयर है रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर का फ्रॉम 2021 ऑनवर्ड्स वो घट रहा है, और कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर क्या हो रहा है, बढ़ रहा है। अंडरस्टूड हियर? समझ में आ रहा है आप लोग को? इफ यू गो बाय द क्लास जो मैंने आप लोग को, आई थिंक the students to whom I have taught, आपको पब्लिक डेट मैंने पढ़ाया है कि नहीं? I think all of you, I have taught in all the classes the central government debt और central government liabilities क्या होते हैं। आप इकोनॉमिक सर्वे का पार्ट देखो और क्लास के लेक्चर्स देखो, and that will be a replica of it. That will be a replica of it. Each and everything I have taught you regarding this. मैंने आपको क्या बताया है, as far as central government debt is concerned, so overall मैंने central government की liabilities बताई है। Central government की liabilities gets bifurcated into two components. One liability that is contracted against consolidated fund of India. The second one is contracted against public account. The one which is contracted against consolidated fund of India, that becomes part of public data or not. Public debt again is being divided into internal and external data or not. Internal debt again is classified into marketable and non-marketable or not. So all these things have been taught to you or not. So, और देखिए, just now I told you that extra budgetary resources are not part of fiscal deficits calculation, but those are part of public data or not. That is, those are part of data or not. Sorry. So see, these are the extra budgetary resources. Did you get all of you? Now see the numbers and we'll be talking about it. See, during discussion in the class also, I have taught you that our debt numbers are not that discouraging. I am again repeating the same statement. Our debt numbers are not that discouraging. Not that discouraging means not encouraging as well. What is the positive side? The positive side is that 90% of the public debt is internal. Under internal, if we talk about dated securities, see, most of the time government has issued dated securities and that is being issued for to the extent of up to 40 years also. So do you know, when the government has issued dated securities borrowed for a longer term, that gives a larger space to the government, that gives larger space to the government, to the economy, to manage its financial position so that it can repay its back, I mean, on the due date of maturity. If that would have been for a shorter time period, that would have created pressure on the economy and its resources, because as an economy will not be getting that much space in order to earn the money and repay it back. So the good part of internal debt is that I have already taught you something called dated securities, and dated securities are issued to the extent of near about 40 years. So as an economy, we can get larger time period to generate sufficient resources so that we can repay it back on due date of maturity. Second important point is that, second important positive thing is that these are internal. These are internal. So that does not cause larger worry to the government. The next important part of public debt is that whatever external debt we do have, our external debt is not more than 10% of total public debt. And those external debt also, we have largely borrowed from multilateral institutions, that too for a longer term, and that too at a concessional rate of interest. So that's what makes our debt position, I mean, quite satisfactory. And as far as total debt is concerned, we are at a very comfortable position. And we can say that whatever forex reserves we do have, around $600 billion, that is sufficient to cover around 13 months of our import cost. And that's what is the overall overview of our external debt position. Understood? External debt position. So अगर आप डेट पोजीशन हमारी कंट्री का देखें तो लार्जली का क्या है, इंटरनल डेट है. जो 10% एक्सटर्नल डेट है दैट इज आल्सो सस्टेनेबल. व्हाई सस्टेनेबल एक्सटर्नल डेट? भाई external debt sustainable because that we have borrowed from multilateral institutions, that is for a longer term, and at the same time that is being borrowed at a concessional rate of interest. Now why I'm talking about that, tenure of the loan also becomes very very important for any economy. अगर मान लीजिए कि हमने मल्टीलैटरल इंस्टीट्यूशन से शॉर्ट टर्म लोन लिए रहते, तो शॉर्ट टर्म में एज एन इकोनॉमी वी मे नॉट गेट दैट मच स्पेस इन ऑर्डर टू अर्न फॉरेन करेंसी so that we can repay it back. So that would have created larger pressure on our forex reserves or not? Definitely yes. But then when we have borrowed for a longer term, definitely that will help us in our being on a very comfortable position as far as our external debt repayment is concerned. So that's what overall is being mentioned here also. जो आप देखेंगे इकोनॉमिक सर्वे की समरी और इकोनॉमिक सर्वे देखेंगे, सो लार्जर पार्ट इज मेंशन्ड रिगार्डिंग दैट ओनली. मैंने आपको एक समरी बता दिया कि हाउ थिंग्स आर एट द ग्राउंड लेवल एज फार एज डेट ऑफ द सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट इज कंसर्न. Now this is retail direct scheme, and under retail direct scheme a particular account is being there, that is retail direct guild. देखिए क्या होते हैं, इसका मतलब first let us understand and then each and everything is there. देखिए बहुत सारे डेटेड सिक्योरिटीज ऐसे होते हैं या कुछ मनी मार्केट इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स भी ऐसे होते हैं कि जहां पर एक स्मॉल इन्वेस्टर चाहे तो इट कैन नॉट इन्वेस्ट, क्योंकि मिनिमम डिनोमिनेशन जो होते थे उसमें इन्वेस्टमेंट के दैट वुड हैव बीन लैक्स. So a small investor, if it wants to participate in debt market, debt segment, so considering the size, it was not able to invest. I'm trying to invest in dated securities or government security, but I cannot do क्योंकि minimum denomination उसमें क्या है, lakhs of rupees है. Gilt का मतलब क्या होता है, there is something called gilt. गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज को हम कहते हैं गिल्ट एज्ड सिक्योरिटीज, मतलब लेस रिस्क सिक्योरिटीज. गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज को हम क्या कहते हैं, गिल्ट एज सिक्योरिटीज, दैट मींस लेस रिस्की सिक्योरिटीज. व्हाई लेस रिस्की भाई, बिकॉज गवर्नमेंट को मैंने लेंड किया है, गवर्नमेंट ने वो सिक्योरिटी इशू किया है, तो कोई भी गवर्नमेंट इशू करती है, सो देयर इज ए लेस चांस ऑफ डिफॉल्ट, लेस चांस ऑफ डिफॉल्ट. तो गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज को हम क्या कहते हैं, गिल्ट एज सिक्योरिटीज. ऐसे सिक्योरिटीज में स्मॉल इन्वेस्टर्स को एनकरेज करने के लिए ताकि वे लोग भी इन्वेस्ट करें, तो गवर्नमेंट ने ऐसा स्कीम क्या निकाला, रिटेल डायरेक्ट स्कीम. और उस स्कीम के अंडर जो रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स है उनको एक ऑनलाइन अपना अकाउंट खोलना होता है, जिसको हम कहते हैं रिटेल डायरेक्ट गिल्ड अकाउंट. ऑनलाइन पोर्टल पर ही है, और जिसमें आप क्या चाहें तो आप किसी भी तरह के डेट इंस्ट्रूमेंट में आप क्या कर सकते हैं, इन्वेस्ट करते हैं, जहां पर मिनिमम आप कितना कर सकते हैं, 10,000 एंड मैक्सिमम ऑफ 2 crores फॉर सिक्योरिटी. सो दिस प्रोविजंस नीड टू बी मार्क्ड अप बाय यू ऑल. अब आपको समझ में आया कि ये ऐसा क्यों किया गया है, इन ऑर्डर टू एनकरेज रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स, स्मॉल इन्वेस्टर्स टू टेक द बेनिफिट ऑफ investment in government securities, which was earlier only provided to high net worth individual. Definitely retail direct scheme has been introduced by the government of India. Are you in line with me? समझ में आ रहा all of you? These are two important measures which the government of India again has taken, which tells a lot of things about transparency in expenditure, government expenditure. I'll tell you, earlier what used to happen, that if you are sitting at a particular government position and you have the authority to sanction any new purchase, so at your take, depending upon your formal and informal negotiation with the vendor, you buy, and in 90% of the cases there were a lot of unfair means involved, and that leads to corruption issues. Now the government has gone for government e-marketplace, और गवर्नमेंट ई-मार्केटप्लेस पे जानते हैं क्या प्रोविजंस है, प्रोविजंस यही है कि भाई एक पर्टिकुलर मुझे मार्कर ऑर्डर करनी है, तो उस प्लेटफॉर्म पर इस मार्कर की क्या प्राइस है. अदर ई कॉमर्स वेबसाइट्स पर, अमेजॉन पर जा रहे हैं या फ्लिपकार्ट पर जा रहे हैं, तो ये मार्कर कितने में बिक रहा है, रेगुलर मार्केट में कितने में ये मार्कर बिक रहा है. और जहां पर अब गवर्नमेंट को लगेगा ना कि सबसे कम में मिल रहा है, तो गवर्नमेंट गो फॉर दैट पर्टिकुलर सोर्स ऑफ परचेजिंग. दैट्स व्हाट इज गवर्नमेंट ई मार्केट प्लेस। इसमें सिंपली क्या है कि डे टू डे जो यूज गुड्स गवर्नमेंट को डे टू डे यूज गुड्स की जरूरत होती है, तो गवर्नमेंट क्या करती है, गवर्नमेंट इज ट्राइंग इट्स बेस्ट टू बाई फ्रॉम ए सोर्स वेयर इट कैन गेट एट ए वेरी चीप एंड अफोर्डेबल रेट्स। सो उस पर्टिकुलर मार्केट प्लेस पर ईच एंड एवरीथिंग इज बीइंग कंपेयर्ड कि मैंने ये मार्कर कितने में खरीदा, अमेजॉन पर कितना मिल रहा था, रेगुलर मार्केट में कितना मिल रहा है, एंड बेस्ड ऑन दैट गवर्नमेंट को जहां पर सस्ता मिलेगा गवर्नमेंट विल गो फॉर इट। सो इन इकोनॉमिक सर्वे देयर इज अ ब्यूटीफुल कंपैरिजन आल्सो कि एक पर्टिकुलर फर्नीचर अलमीरा आई मीन या कुछ भी गवर्नमेंट कोई फर्नीचर खरीदना चाह रही है, तो different even to the minute extent also government is monitoring the expenditure and that is through government marketplace. So expenditure efficiency में दो important schemes government ने launch किया है। एक तो e-marketplace for routine procurement, कोई भी चीज आपको पता है ना, गवर्नमेंट ऑफिस में पेन से लेकर, पेंसिल से लेकर, मार्कर से लेकर, फर्नीचर से लेकर, अलमीरा से लेकर, कंप्यूटर से लेकर, many things are being purchased by the government for day-to-day operations or not. So in order to make those spending efficient, in order to increase transparency in those spending also, the government e-marketplace helps a lot. दूसरा क्या है, दूसरा स्कीम गवर्नमेंट ने क्या किया है, रिफॉर्म्स इन पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट एंड प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजमेंट। और इसमें क्या है, सिंपली गवर्नमेंट नॉन रूटीन गुड्स खरीदती है। जैसे मान लीजिए कि कुछ कंस्ट्रक्शन ऑफ हाईवेज में कुछ यूज करना है, बिल्डिंग्स में कुछ यूज करना है, कंसल्टेंट्स, मुझे किसको कंसल्टेंट अपॉइंट करना है या नहीं अपॉइंट करना है, तो मान लीजिए गवर्नमेंट अगर कंसल्टेंट अपॉइंट करती है तो गवर्नमेंट नीड टू प्रोवाइड ए फी और नॉट। So I need to get the best consultant at a very affordable price. What the government will think about? So उन सब चीजों के लिए गवर्नमेंट ने क्या निकाला है, public procurement and project management. Public procurement and project management. So two important schemes which will lead to transparency in government expenditure. पहला मैंने क्या बोला, गवर्नमेंट ई मार्केट प्लेस, और दूसरा मैंने क्या बोला, रिफॉर्म पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट एंड प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजमेंट। डे टू डे गुड्स के लिए क्या है, गवर्नमेंट ई मार्केट प्लेस, और जो नॉन रूटीन गुड्स हैं, समझ में आ रहा है, कोई गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज जो नॉन रूटीन इन नेचर का है, डेली में जिसको यूज नहीं करते हैं, उसके लिए गवर्नमेंट क्या करता है, पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट एंड प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजमेंट। अब देखिए 3 मेथड्स हैं जो आपको याद करने पड़ेंगे, दो जो आर ऑप्टिंग फॉर प्री दिस टाइम। पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट एंड प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजमेंट में 3 मेथड है। पहला मेथड है लिस्ट कॉस्ट मेथड, दूसरा क्या है क्वालिटी कम कॉस्ट बेस्ड सिलेक्शन, और तीसरा क्या है सिंगल सोर्स सिलेक्शन। इन तीनों मेथड के बेसिस पर गवर्नमेंट क्या कर रही है, पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट एंड प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजमेंट करती है। समझ में आ रहा है? इस सिंपली मतलब क्या हुआ, लिस्ट कॉस्ट में क्या होता है, जो सबसे सस्ता देगा भाई हम उसी का खरीदेंगे। समझ में आ रहा? इसमें 2 स्टेप इन्वॉल्व होते हैं। कॉन्ट्रैक्ट किसी बिडर को दिया जाता है जिसका सबसे कम फाइनेंशियल बिड होता है, और जो क्या है टेक्निकल इवैल्यूएशन पास किया है कि भाई किस तरह के गुड्स उसने प्रोवाइड करता है कि नहीं, उसकी एक्सपर्टीज है कि नहीं, तो ये दोनों टेस्ट पास करेगा तो गवर्नमेंट उसी से क्या करेगा, प्रोक्योर करेगा। दैट्स व्हाट इज लीस्ट कॉस्ट मेथड। दूसरा क्या है कि इन क्वालिटी कम कॉस्ट बेस्ड सिलेक्शन। यहाँ पर क्या है कि जो बिडर होगा उसको दोनों टेस्ट पास करना होगा, टेक्निकल और फाइनेंशियल प्रपोजल्स पे। इसका मतलब वो टेक्निकल भी साउंड हो और फाइनेंशियली भी क्या हो, वो कम में मुझे दे। और दूसरा क्या है सिंगल सोर्स सिलेक्शन, जहां पर जो 2 और मोर वेंडर्स सप्लाई करेंगे कमोडिटी या कोई भी टेक्नोलॉजी को, बट जो स्टेट होगा, जो गवर्नमेंट होगा, एक वेंडर को सिलेक्ट करेगा ओवर द अदर्स जो कि उनको सस्ता दे। समझ में रहा? दैट्स व्हाट इज सिंगल सोर्स सिलेक्शन। तीनों पॉइंट याद रखोगे ना। पब्लिक प्रोक्योरमेंट के 3 मेथड्स क्या है, लीस्ट कॉस्ट, समझ में रहा, दूसरा क्या है क्वालिटी कम कॉस्ट, और तीसरा क्या है सिंगल सोर्स सिलेक्शन। अंडरस्टूड? सो डोंट यू थिंक, अगर आपको आ रहा है क्वेश्चंस, इफ द क्वेश्चन इज बीइंग आस्क्ड इन मेंस कि एक्सपेंडिचर मैनेजमेंट के लिए गवर्नमेंट ने क्या क्या स्टेप्स लिए हैं, तो आप बताइए दोनों स्टेप्स को लिखेंगे कि नहीं? एक्सपेंडिचर मैनेजमेंट के लिए these are I mean very important initiatives by the government or not? this will infuse transparency in expenditure management or not. So that's what you can write under it. डायरेक्ट टैक्स मेजर्स में मैंने क्या बोला, आप लोग को बताया भी कि ई फाइलिंग पोर्टल इशू कर दिया है गवर्नमेंट ने, फेसलेस असेसमेंट स्कीम मैंने ऑलरेडी बता रहा था आपको, फेसलेस अपील स्कीम गवर्नमेंट ने इशू किया है, फेसलेस पेनाल्टी स्कीम गवर्नमेंट ने इंट्रोड्यूस किया है. दैट्स व्हाट ऑल हैज बीन टेकन, दैट व्हाट मेजर्स गवर्नमेंट हैज टेकन एज फार एज डायरेक्ट टैक्स इज कंसर्न. इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स के अंदर एक चीज मैं तुम लोग को बताना चाह रहा हूं, that is something called inverted duty structure. Inverted duty structure, I think most of you know. नहीं, देखिए अगर आप लोग न्यूज़पेपर पढ़े होंगे ना, तो I mean it's hardly 1 month wherein our finance minister has come clear on what GST rate will be applicable on footwears and textiles. Footwears and textiles, and there it was that was in the news as far as inverted duty structure is concerned. So what do you mean by inverted duty structure? मैं बता दे रहा हूँ. Let's say I mean this is the marker which I produce, I manufacture, and in producing this marker there are many inputs which I purchase. So if GST being paid by me on buying of inputs or raw materials in order to produce this marker is high, and GST on this marker is low. मैंने इनपुट लिया, इनपुट्स जो मैंने लिया, जो भी इनपुट्स खरीदा इस मार्कर को बनाने के लिए, उस पर जीएसटी क्या था, हाई था, और जब मैं इस मार्कर को बेचा तो मुझे जीएसटी कितना मिला, लो मिला. The GST rate on this finished product is less as compared to the inputs which are being required in order to manufacture this marker. So here inverted duty structure is being applied. What does this means? Whenever such things happen, the company who manufacture this marker, it will go for input credit or input tax credit from the government. Input tax credit, 10 रुपया मैंने टैक्स पे कर दिया गवर्नमेंट को when I bought raw materials related to this, और मैंने इसको बेचा तो मुझे 2 रुपये जीएसटी मिला है, तो मुझे क्या मिलना चाहिए, मुझे 5 माइनस 2 3 और गवर्नमेंट से मिलना चाहिए. मुझे 3 की क्या मिलना चाहिए, गवर्नमेंट से. इसका मतलब दैट्स व्हाट इज कंसीडर्ड टू बी इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट. इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट. आई विल टेल यू मोर अबाउट इट. इन केस ऑफ फुटवेयर्स व्हाट यूज्ड टू हैपन, जो फुटवेयर्स में जो जीएसटी एप्लीकेबल था, 1000 रुपये का अगर फुटवेयर खरीदते हैं तो उस पर 5% गवर्नमेंट लेती थी, और 1000 रुपये से अधिक का आप ये करते हैं तो उस पर गवर्नमेंट कितना लेती थी, 12%. बट कभी कभी ऐसा देखा गया है कि जो रॉ मटेरियल्स फुटवेयर बनाने के लिए कोई मैन्युफैक्चरर बोरो करता था, सो इट यूज्ड टू पे टैक्स टू द एक्सटेंट ऑफ 18%. That was leading to huge loss for the manufacturer. क्या लॉस होते थे, 2-4 मैं एक एग्जांपल देकर बता रहा हूं. मैं मैन्युफैक्चरर हूं, मैं फुटवेयर बनाता हूं, मैंने 18% ऑलरेडी इनपुट पर टैक्स पे कर दिया. कि किसको पे किया, जहां से मैंने रॉ मटेरियल खरीदा. ठीक है, दैट मस्ट हैव गॉन टू द गवर्नमेंट. बट बताओ अगर इनपुट पर मैंने 18% पे कर दिया तो मेरा कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन कितना बढ़ेगा. सो कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन बढ़ेगा, सो डेफिनेटली एज ए मैन्युफैक्चरर आई मे नॉट बी एबल टू सर्वाइव एंड सस्टेन. दूसरा क्या होगा कि जब मैंने इसको बेचा तो आई लेविट, जो कि गवर्नमेंट क्या करती है, लेवी कर रही है. गवर्नमेंट के स्टैंडर्ड रेट्स हैं कि नहीं जीएसटी में, तो वहां पर कम है, और मैंने इनपुट्स के लिए जो पे किया वो क्या किया, हाई पे किया. इस चीज को कम करने के लिए गवर्नमेंट क्या करती है, जीएसटी में ये प्रोविजंस है कि अगर आपने कोई गुड्स बनाया और उसको इनपुट आपने जो रॉ मटेरियल खरीदा बनाने के लिए उस पर आपने टैक्स पे ऑलरेडी कर दिया है, तो आप गवर्नमेंट से क्या लेते हो, इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट लेते हो। इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट लेते हो कि भैया ये मैंने मार्कर बनाया, मैंने 2 रुपया क्या है ऑलरेडी टैक्स पे कर दिया। अगर मान लो इस पर मैंने क्या किया कि 5 रुपये जीएसटी लिया, तो अब मैं गवर्नमेंट को कितना पे करूंगा, 3 रुपये पे करूंगा कि नहीं, 3 ही रुपया पे करूंगा कि नहीं। अगर मान लो कि मैं इस पर 1 रुपया टैक्स लिया, तब क्या होगा, गवर्नमेंट को मुझे पे करना चाहिए कि नहीं, गवर्नमेंट को मुझे पे करना चाहिए कि नहीं। क्यों, क्योंकि मैंने अधिक क्या कर दिया है, इससे अधिक इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट, इनपुट्स पर मैंने ज्यादा टैक्स पे किया। सो ऐसे कंडीशंस में इन्वर्टेड ड्यूटी स्ट्रक्चर इज बीइंग अप्लाइड, इन्वर्टेड ड्यूटी स्ट्रक्चर इज बीइंग अप्लाइड, जहां पर मेरा क्रेडिट क्या होगा, अकुमुलेट होते जाएगा गवर्नमेंट में, गवर्नमेंट के पास, एंड आफ्टर ए सर्टेन पीरियड ऑफ टाइम मैं वो क्रेडिट क्या करूंगा, गवर्नमेंट से वापस लूंगा। अब देखिए एक एग्जांपल मैं दे रहा हूं, हम लोग XYZ कोई भी गुड्स बना रहे हैं, हमने क्या किया, 10% नहीं लेते हैं, 10 रुपीज इनपुट टैक्स, इनपुट्स पर हमने क्या किया है, टैक्स जीएसटी क्या किया है, पे किया है, कितना, 10 रुपीज। तो ये मेरा क्या हुआ, क्रेडिट हुआ जो गवर्नमेंट के पास है, क्योंकि वो गुड्स, वो इनपुट्स मैं लेकर ये गुड्स क्या कर रहा हूं, बना रहा हूं। और मैंने जो बेचा गवर्नमेंट को, मैंने जब बेचा वो प्रोडक्ट को, तो क्या हुआ, मान लो कि मैंने 5 रुपया जीएसटी कलेक्ट किया, मैंने क्या किया, 5 रुपये जीएसटी कलेक्ट किया, मैंने गवर्नमेंट को 5 रुपये पे कर दिया, बट 10 रुपया वो गवर्नमेंट से मुझे आने को है कि नहीं। अब मान लो ये पैसा तो मेरा जब तक गवर्नमेंट क्लियर नहीं करे, गवर्नमेंट के पास मेरा ब्लॉक रहेगा कि नहीं। सो मैं अगर स्मॉल प्लेयर हूं, तो मेरा वर्किंग कैपिटल इज विद द गवर्नमेंट और नॉट। So that's why small manufacturers are making noises against this practice कि भैया अगर इतना इतना दिन उनका वर्किंग कैपिटल गवर्नमेंट के पास ब्लॉक होगा, so how they'll be initiating further manufacturing activities. And with this in concern, गवर्नमेंट ने हमारी फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर ने फुटवेयर के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ये डिसीजन लिया, जहां पर उन्होंने जीएसटी के रेट को सारे फुटवेयर्स पर बढ़ाकर कितना कर दिया, 12%। 12%। तो इसका मतलब क्या हुआ, इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट अब क्या हो जाएगा, इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट क्या होगा, मिनिमाइज हो जाएगा कि नहीं, मिनिमाइज हो जाएगा ना। तो दिस इज इन कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ इन्वर्टेड ड्यूटी स्ट्रक्चर, इन्वर्टेड ड्यूटी स्ट्रक्चर, अंडरस्टूड। सो आपको समझ में, ऑल ऑफ यू अंडरस्टूड, इन्वर्टेड ड्यूटी स्ट्रक्चर क्या है, इन जीएसटी प्रोविजंस क्या है, whenever I am producing certain goods, if I am purchasing any inputs, if I have paid taxes to the those supplier, so definitely the credit of it I'll be getting for those from the government in the form of input tax credit. अगर मैं उसी प्रोडक्ट को कम जीएसटी के रेट पर बेचा, so I have purchased the inputs at a high GST rate and I have sold that goods at a low GST rate, so that will create a case of inverted duty structure. In the recent months, you must have seen कि न्यूज था कि बहुत सारे कंपनीज ने फेक इनवॉइस बनाकर crores of rupees गवर्नमेंट से किस फॉर्म में ली, इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट के फॉर्म में. That's what is input tax credit and inverted duty structure. Understood, all of you? Anyone having any doubt? एक चैप्टर में 1.5 घंटे. Now external sector. Those who will be going for pre, you need to understand WTO's good barometric index, trade barometric index क्या होता है. ये क्या होता है कि it talks about how the merchandise trade will be 3 months ahead before the statistics, final statistics comes out, it gives an indication as to how world trade will be. So world goods trade barometer index क्या होता है? It gives its predictions, or it gives its it gives an indication as to how international trade or global trade will be from 3 months ahead. समझ में आ रहा? तो 3 months के बाद स्टैटिस्टिक्स क्या करेगा क्या नहीं करेगा उसका प्रेडिक्शन वो आज ही के डेट में देता है, एंड दैट इज बीइंग डन विद WTO गुड्स ट्रेड बैरोमेट्रिक इंडेक्स। इसकी बेसलाइन वैल्यू 100 है, अगर वैल्यू 100 से अधिक है तो इसका मतलब इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड क्या होगा? बढ़ेगा, और उसकी वैल्यू क्या है? 100 से कम है, तो इसका मतलब 3 months डाउन द लाइन ग्लोबल ट्रेड विल नॉट बी पॉजिटिव। अगर एक्सपोर्ट्स की बात करें हम लोग, तो आपको पता है कि जो हमारी एक्सपोर्ट्स पोजीशन है, दैट इज समथिंग व्हिच इज कमेंडेबल। आई मीन our total exports this year has no doubt touched more than $400 billion, and that is something commendable, because when exports of the country has increased, definitely it must have largely contributed to the GDP of the country, which we already discussed, and that is a good sign. That is a good sign. दूसरा क्या है कि हमें एक्सपोर्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हमें ये भी देखना है कि जो एक्सपोर्ट्स हमारे बढ़े हैं वो किस वजह से बढ़े हैं। तो हाई ग्रोथ इन पेट्रोलियम, ऑयल एंड लुब्रिकेंट्स, जिसको POL बोलते हैं, पेट्रोलियम, ऑयल एंड लुब्रिकेंट्स, हमारा एक्सपोर्ट सबसे ज्यादा हम इस चीज को एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं। ये क्या होता है? दैट कंसिस्ट ऑफ 15% ऑफ द टोटल एक्सपोर्ट्स। तो अगर सबसे ज्यादा क्या हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, टोटल एक्सपोर्ट्स में कंट्रीब्यूशन किस कमोडिटी का है, तो आप लोग क्या याद रखोगे? POL, पेट्रोलियम, ऑयल एंड लुब्रिकेंट्स। अगर कंट्री के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में आपको याद रखना है कि सबसे ज्यादा हम किस कंट्री में एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, तो याद रखिएगा कि यूएसए हमारा टॉप यूएसए है जहां पर हम सबसे ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, फॉलोड बाय UAE एंड चाइना। सो 3 मेजर कंट्रीज आपको याद रहेगा जो जहां पर इंडिया सबसे ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट करती है। नंबर 1 क्या है? यूएसए, UAE एंड चाइना। अगर हम इंपोर्ट की बात करें, समझ में आ रहा? तो इंपोर्ट देख लीजिए कि इंपोर्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में भी जो नॉन POL है या नॉन गोल्ड है एंड सिल्वर है वो 64.3 है। देखिए सबसे ज्यादा हमने इंपोर्ट भी POL किया है, और गोल्ड एंड सिल्वर हमने इंपोर्ट किया है 9.1%, 9.1% ऑफ टोटल इंपोर्ट्स। तो सबसे ज्यादा शेयर, समझ में आ रहा है? अगर कोई पूछेगा कि इंपोर्ट्स में किसका है, तो इंपोर्ट्स में भी हमारा क्या है? पेट्रोलियम, ऑयल एंड लुब्रिकेंट्स। अगर इंपोर्ट से देखें हम, तो हमारी किस कंट्री से हम सबसे ज्यादा इंपोर्ट करते हैं, तो है चाइना, UAE एंड USA। बताइए, USA इज द कंट्री वेयर हम सबसे ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, बट आउट ऑफ द 3 लार्जेस्ट कंट्रीज वेयर सबसे ज्यादा हम इंपोर्ट कहां से करते हैं, तो क्या है हमारा? चाइना। देखिए इन द रिसेंट इयर्स गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया हैज डन लॉट ऑफ थिंग्स इन ऑर्डर टू रिड्यूस द ट्रेड डेफिसिट्स बिटवीन इंडिया एंड चाइना, and that is a good sign where Indian government is taking, and that is a very strategic decision also. That is a strategic decision also which the government of India is trying, because see today strategically if you talk about, you can win a war not by nuclear weapons, but today economic weapons are more dangerous than nuclear weapons, and that's what India is going, and India should go for it also. आपको ट्रेडिंग सर्विसेज की मैंने आपको बात बताई, तो आपको बताया है कि देखो जो सर्विसेज जो है हमारे, हमने IT एंड IT इनेबल्ड सर्विसेज, हमारा सबसे ज्यादा सबसे मेजर कंट्रीब्यूशन होता है ट्रेडिंग सर्विसेज में। और जो मेजर हमने एक्सपोर्ट किया है, तो देखिए कंप्यूटर में, बिजनेस एंड ट्रांसपोर्टेशन सर्विसेज में हमने सबसे ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट किया है, दैट कंसिस्ट ऑफ 80% ऑफ टोटल सर्विसेज एक्सपोर्ट्स। और सर्विसेज इंपोर्ट्स जो है हमारा क्या है? मेनली ऑन अकाउंट ऑफ पेमेंट फॉर बिजनेस, ट्रांसपोर्ट, ट्रेवल एंड कंप्यूटर सर्विसेज। सो दीज आर दी ट्रेडिंग सर्विसेज। करेंट अकाउंट बैलेंस के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखिए यहाँ पर करेंट अकाउंट बैलेंस है, और करेंट अकाउंट बैलेंस एज ए परसेंट ऑफ जीडीपी। 1920 में आपका करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट क्या था? 0.9% ऑफ जीडीपी था कि नहीं आपका डेफिसिट? करेंट अकाउंट बैलेंस माइनस 0.9% है, इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? करेंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट था कि नहीं? और करेंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट कितना था आपका? 9% ऑफ जीडीपी, जो कि क्या हुआ? सरप्लस बाई 2020-21 में क्या था? वो सरप्लस था कि नहीं? रीजन आपको पता है, कंप्लीट लॉकडाउन। और अभी क्या है आपकी जो करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट क्या है? नेगेटिव है। करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट 0.2% ऑफ जीडीपी है, सो दैट्स व्हाई इट इज नेगेटिव। देखो यहां पर ये जो करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट तुम देख रहे हो ना, दैट नेचुरली कैन रिजल्ट इनटू बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट डेफिसिट और नॉट। मैंने एट द बिगिनिंग ऑफ द सेशन मैंने वही बताया कि दो इन 21-22 वी experience current account deficits, but due to capital inflows in the form of FDI and FPI, this is being compensated, and that resulted into balance of payment surplus. That's what I talk at the beginning of the session or not, and that's what is all about. I mean balance of payment and forex reserves. I have already told you forex reserves हमारा near about $600 billion reserves है, that is largely enough to cover import position of near about 13 months. एक इंपॉर्टेंट टर्मिनोलॉजी याद रखिएगा, नेट इंटरनेशनल इन्वेस्टमेंट पोजीशन। नेट इंटरनेशनल इन्वेस्टमेंट पोजीशन ये क्या होता है? दिस इज लार्जली द डिफरेंस बिटवीन द वैल्यू ऑफ फाइनेंशियल एसेट्स ऑफ रेसिडेंट्स ऑफ एन इकोनॉमी दैट आर क्लेम्स ऑन नॉन रेसिडेंट्स। मतलब जो इंडिया से बाहर है वहां से जो मुझे पेमेंट आना होगा, और जो मुझे पेमेंट एनी फॉर्म में मुझे नॉन रेसिडेंट को करना है, दोनों का जो डिफरेंस होता है ना, उसी को हम क्या कहते हैं? नेट इंटरनेशनल इन्वेस्टमेंट पोजीशन। समझ में आ रहा? इसका मतलब क्या होता है? ये बताता है कि हमारी लायबिलिटी रेस्ट ऑफ द वर्ल्ड पर कितनी है और रेस्ट ऑफ वर्ल्ड की लायबिलिटी मेरे ऊपर कितनी है। समझ में आ रहा? रेस्ट ऑफ वर्ल्ड से मुझे कितना आना है और रेस्ट ऑफ द वर्ल्ड को मुझे कितना देना है। That's what it talks about, the difference between what we'll be getting and what we have to pay. समझ में आ रहा? That's what is net international investment position. That's why I have written, I mean, the difference between the value of financial assets of residents of an economy that are claims on non-residents, मुझे वहां से आना है, and the liabilities of residents of an economy to non-residents, मेरी liabilities दूसरे के लिए। तो जो दोनों में डिफरेंस होगा, that will determine NIIP, net international investment position. I told you about external debt, nothing need to be told about it. I've already taught you कि external debt क्या है। अब देखो मॉनेटरी मैनेजमेंट में दो तीन चीजें मुझे तुम्हें बतानी है। अकोमोडेटिव स्टैंस क्या होता है, न्यूट्रल स्टैंस क्या होता है, हॉकिश स्टैंस क्या होते हैं, एंड कैलिब्रेटेड टाइटनिंग क्या होता है। मोस्ट ऑफ द टर्म्स these are must have heard while monetary policy committee meetings or any statements by RBI governor. Understood? देखो अगर तुमने अप्रैल की मीटिंग देखी होगी आरबीआई की, तो आपने उन्होंने अपने स्टेटमेंट में बोला था कि हमारे जो स्टैंड है अकोमोडेटिव है। अकोमोडेटिव क्या मतलब होता है कि देयर इज अ लार्जर स्पेस वेयर वी कैन इंक्रीज मनी सप्लाई इन ऑर्डर टू इंक्रीज इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ। इसका मतलब क्या हुआ कि द फोकस विल बी ऑन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ। पे अटेंशन टू व्हाट आई एम सेइंग। अकोमोडेटिव स्टैंस का मतलब क्या होता है कि अकोमोडेटिव देयर इज a space wherein money supply can be injected in order to infuse economic growth. इसका मतलब there will be chance wherein rate of interest can be reduced. So that's what is the situation of accommodative stance. Neutral stance में क्या होता है? It can either cut rate or increase rate. समझ में रहा? बढ़ा भी सकता है, कम भी कर सकता है। हॉकिश स्टैंस में क्या होता है कि भाई at any point of time I need to keep inflation in control So what I need to do, I need to increase the repo rate by 40 bps, and that caused shock to the financial markets. And that's why I told you कि one day that person will come in the mid of the term, it will come and announce that 40 bps hike. मैं वही सोच रहा था कि 1.5 month में क्या हो गया इकोनॉमी में. They would have increased in the last MPC meeting only. I mean, that would have been very substantial also. I mean, they must have, I mean, tried to experiment कि कुछ अच्छा हो. I mean, the wars could have stopped between Russia and Ukraine, but वो कहाँ stop होने वाला है. The complications, the impact of this is largely now felt on the Indian economy. And government of India also does not have done too much on supply side of inflation. Supply side, जो major problem है inflation का, it's not only from the demand, it's also from the supply. And that's why most of the time when the RBI increases its interest rate in order to control inflation, I mean, it is not 100% successful, because if the regions are supply, so anyway we need to increase the supply also. But here, when the government has, when RBI has increased interest rate by 40 bps, it is trying to control demand. It is trying to control demand. Understood? So this is what is hawkish stance. Hawkish stance में क्या होता है कि RBI takes in measure to control the inflation. And calibrated tightening का मतलब क्या होता है कि मतलब अभी भी गवर्नमेंट जो आरबीआई है ये मूड में नहीं है कि वो रेपो रेट को क्या करे, कम करे. इसका मतलब क्या हो रहा है कि it does not want to take any risk as far as inflation is concerned. उसी को हम कहते हैं calibrated tightening. Understood all of you? Accommodative means space है भाई थोड़ा सा इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ का. हॉकिश में मैंने क्या बोला कि नीड टू कंट्रोल इन्फ्लेशन. न्यूट्रल में क्या बोला कि कैन कट ऑल्सो, कैन इंक्रीज ऑल्सो. एंड कैलिब्रेटेड टाइटनिंग का मतलब होगा कि वी विल नॉट बी गोइंग फॉरवर्ड इन ऑर्डर टू ईज द कंट्रोल ऑफ मनी सप्लाई. Why? Because I mean we do not want to take any risk on inflation, and that's what is calibrated tightening. So these are important terms which will be getting in economic survey or the newspaper or any monetary policy committee review. So you need to understand this. देखिए मैंने लिखा भी है यहाँ पर कि 2020 मई 2020 से आप देखेंगे कैलिब्रेटेड टाइटनिंग का मतलब मैंने बताया कि the RBI does not want to take any risk on inflation, and that's why any cut in repo rate, I mean RBI will not do in the near or sooner or in the near future. So calibrated tightening का मतलब क्या होता है? Monetary tightening. I mean it will not lead to increase in ease of money supply. So easy money, I mean क्या करेगा? Will not infuse in the market. That's what is calibrated tightening. देखिए 2020 से आपने देखा होगा कि the way RBI has reduced its repo rate and it brought its repo rate near to 4%. So that what was the motive? The motive was to increase economic growth or not? So what it will be? It will be accommodative monetary policy or not? That's what we discuss largely. So हमारा stance क्या था? Accommodative था. समझ में आ रहा? But उस समय क्यों accommodative था? क्योंकि हमारा इन्फ्लेशन क्या था? कंट्रोल था. और इन्फ्लेशन का हमारा बैंड आपको पता है ना क्या है? इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग. व्हाट इज द आरबीआई मेन ऑब्जेक्टिव? आईटी, इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग. और हमारी इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग क्या था? 4% विद अ बैंड ऑफ ±2%. in a recent year, in a recent months, that has increased to 6.7 or not. So that has crossed the the band or not, which you have mentioned. So definitely that is that requires the need for hawkish stance by RBI or not, and that's what led RBI to increase its policy rates. Understood? समझ में आ रहा है ना आप लोगों को? Here I have written something called money multiplier measured as a ratio of M3 to MO. M3 means broader money supply or not. आप लोग को money multiplier while teaching you money supply, credit multiplier, deposit multiplier and money multiplier. What was money multiplier? Money multiplier was equal to capital M upon H or not. M क्या था? Capital M was money supply or not? H was high powered money or not? The reserve money is also called high powered money or not? MO जो money supply है, here capital M means broad money or not? Capital M means broad money or not? Broad money को ही हम क्या कहते हैं? M3 कहते हैं कि नहीं? That's why आप economic survey देखेंगे तो what they have written, money multiplier is measured as a ratio of M3 upon MO. MO क्या है आपका? M0 क्या है? रिजर्व मनी है कि नहीं? रिजर्व मनी इज मॉनेटरी बेस और हाई पावर्ड मनी और नॉट? और जब हम मनी सप्लाई की बात करते हैं तो हम किस मनी को कंसीडर करते हैं? किस मेजर ऑफ मनी सप्लाई को कंसीडर करते हैं? M3. किसको कंसीडर करते हैं? M3. समझ में आ रहा? इसीलिए हम M3 को क्यों भाई? क्योंकि हम M3 को क्या कंसीडर करते हैं? ब्रॉड मनी. आप लोग बताया है ना मैंने, M3 को मैंने क्या बताया? ब्रॉड मनी. सो मनी मल्टीप्लायर generally it's considered to be the ratio of money supply upon high powered money and can be measured as M3 upon M0. Did you get this, all of you? लग रहा है तुम्हें कि तुमने कुछ पढ़ा है और तुमको समझ में आ रही है. और ये सब चीजें देखो मैं अपने से नहीं लिखा, इकोनॉमिक सर्वे का पार्ट है, तुम्हारे नोटबुक का भी पार्ट होना चाहिए और ये है तुम्हारे नोटबुक का पार्ट. देखो बैंकिंग सेक्टर में दो चीजें बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. इन द लास्ट फ्यू इयर्स द वे IBC इंसॉल्वेंसी bankruptcy code, the way the government has formulated and implemented also, that has come out with very positive results. और उस पॉजिटिव रिजल्ट्स की वजह से एक 2-4 साल पहले the banking assets were in largely stress and the banks were largely in problems, but in the last 2 to 3 years, I mean, even though there was pandemic, the banking performance has been very, very well. And not only gross non-performing assets, but their net non-performing assets has also come down. अब आपको दो बातें मुझे बतानी है कि नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स क्या होते हैं. तो कोई भी एसेट्स जिसकी रिपेमेंट आज से 90 डेज के बाद होनी है, अगर 90 डेज के बाद भी उसकी प्रिंसिपल और या प्रिंसिपल या इंटरेस्ट कुछ भी अगर वो रिपेमेंट बैंक को नहीं किया गया, तो बैंक उस एसेट्स को क्या समझता है? नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स. समझ में आ रहा? बैंक उस एसेट को क्या कंसीडर करता है? अपना एसेट्स. बैंक का एसेट्स क्या होता है? लोन्स एंड एडवांसेस. बैंक का एसेट्स क्या होता है? लोन्स एंड एडवांसेस. तो बैंक ने लोन दिया, समझ में आ रहा? लोन्स एंड एडवांसेस के फॉर्म में, और ये जो लोन दिया वो अगर 90 डेज आज उसकी ड्यू डेट ऑफ रिपेमेंट थी और आज से 90 डेज के बाद भी आज इसकी ड्यू डेट ऑफ रिपेमेंट है उस लोन्स एंड एडवांसेस की, बट आप लोगों ने ना उसकी आज पेमेंट किया, ना अगले 90 डेज तक आपने उसकी प्रिंसिपल और इंटरेस्ट की कोई भी रिपेमेंट नहीं किया, सो दैट एसेट्स विल बी कंसीडर्ड टू बी नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स. तो नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स के दो पार्ट होते हैं, ग्रॉस एंड नेट. समझ में आ रहा? तो इन द लास्ट 2 to 3 years हमने क्या देखा है कि बोथ GNPA and NNPA both has come down, and that is a good sign as far as banking assets are concerned. National Asset Construction Company Limited, जिसको हम लोग बैड बैंक्स भी बोलते हैं. क्या बोलते हैं? बैड बैंक्स. The most important challenge which a bank face is its recovery. When we started liberalization way back in 1990s, then from that time only, in order to speed up the recovery, we set up something called DRT, that was Debt Recovery Tribunals, sorry. But then to certain extent they were successful, but largely most of the loan defaults were not resolved through DRT also. There were certain limitations with DRT. Then in 2005 we came out with something called SARFAESI Act, SARFAESI. SARFAESI means securitization of assets, reconstruction, SARFAESI. I'll write it for you all. securitization, securitization of assets and reconstruction of surfacing, financial securitization of assets and reconstruction of financial. What this means? Securitization of assets and reconstruction of Financial Enforcement Act. Financial Enforcement Act. Understood? So in 2005, we came out with this. Understood? Securitization of assets and reconstruction of Financial Enforcement Act. Surfacing. I'll get it for you. Is it fine? Or Securities Interest Act hai? Yes, that's what I was missing. Something. Securities Interest Act. मुझे याद आ रहा था. So write it down. Securitization and reconstruction of financial assets and enforcement of Securities Interest Act. And enforcement of Securities Interest Act. Surfacing. FAESI. Securitization of asset and reconstruction of financial assets and enforcement of Securities Interest Act. So in 2005, we came out with SurfACI Act. Understood? Then from there onwards, when SurfACI Act was also not that much successful, so we started thinking of reconstruction company, and these reconstruction companies are not new in the financial world. There are many countries like Malaysia and Britain, they do have the concept of bad banks. Now, what are these asset reconstruction companies do? What does they do? Let's say a particular bank called XYZ had loans defaults of 100 rupees. And these 100 rupees default on the balance sheet of the bank is troubling bank, because banks wants to be clean on the balance sheets, because that default is not in the interest of any bank's financial conditions. So what do these means? Agar bataiye, if all the resources government of India, all the resources banks invest in recovery of this, and if even after this they are not able to recover, what they do with this? They need to write off these loans. They need to write off these loans. That is not a permanent solution, because anyhow bank need to recover this 100 rupees or not. So what is the concept all about? The concept is that these 100 rupees the bank will be selling to something called bad bank or ARC. Bad bank or ARC. Understood? Bad bank or ARC. These bad bank or ARC will buy these bad loans. At a discounted rate. एक सिंपल एग्जांपल बताऊं. आपने उनका पैसा लिया था, आप नहीं दे रही हो आपका पैसा. आपने क्या किया कि वो डॉन है अपने एरिया की, उसको बोला कि 100 रुपया मेरा लिए नहीं दे रही है, तो 100 रुपया उसे कलेक्ट कर ले, 80 रुपया मेरा होगा और 20 रुपया तुम ले लेना. शी इज वेरी हैप्पी. वो गई, उसे कैसे भी कलेक्ट किया, 20 रुपया उसने लिया और 80 रुपये आपको मिल गया. तो आपने उसको लोन कितने में बेचा? एट ए डिस्काउंटेड रेट और नॉट? व्हाट सी इज बैड बैंक और नॉट? सी इज ARC और नॉट? That's what is the concept of ARC. But यहाँ पर वैसा नहीं होता है. That is form of a company, but largely concept यही है. Concept क्या है? किसी a particular bank cannot invest all its resources in recovery. In recovery, there is a lot of litigation cost for a particular bank also. The main function of a bank, prime business of the bank is not recovery, but lending and borrowing. So most of the time, if the loan amount is very, very less, I mean, it has been seen that litigation cost more than the loan amount. So in such a situation, what are the alternatives with the bank? So the bank will sell those bad loans to a particular company called ARC, that is Asset Reconstruction Company. See, Asset Reconstruction Company is also not new in Indian context. We do have many asset reconstruction company, but then those asset reconstruction company are not largely successful. So that's why Government of India, I mean, in Union Budget 21-22, they have announced for something called National Asset Construction Company Limited, and these Asset Construction Company Limited will buy the bad loans, and who will manage that bad loans? For that, another company has been created by, created by the government, and that is called Asset Management Company. उन दोनों कंपनी के नाम भी गवर्नमेंट ने बताया है. पहला जो है एसेट रिकंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी का नाम रहेगा, द नेम ऑफ इट विल बी नेशनल एसेट रिकंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी लिमिटेड, और दूसरे का जो एसेट मैनेजमेंट कंपनी होगी उसका नाम रहेगा इंडियन डेट रेजोल्यूशन कंपनी लिमिटेड. NARCL में both public sector and private sector banks के public sector banks के stake रहेंगे इसमें. NARCL में it will be owned by public sector banks, जिसका प्रोमोटर कौन होगा? कैनरा बैंक होगा. ये प्री के लिए याद रखना. और जो IDRCL है, जो एसेट मैनेजमेंट कंपनी है, उसको क्या होगा? दैट विल बी ओन्ड बाय बोथ पब्लिक एंड प्राइवेट सेक्टर. Both public and private sector. These informations you need to remember for pre. Deposit insurance in India. देखिए, I'll take you 5 minutes. This is the last topic which I'll be going forward. See, in 1958, sorry, it's 58 or 61. By the provisions of DICGC Act, Deposit Insurance and Credit Corporation, this institution was formed, and this institution was formed in order to provide insurance to the depositors who deposit money to the banks. What if a bank defaults? What if bank is liquidated? So what will be the money of investors? So in order to protect the money of depositors, a particular institution was created in 1960s, that was Deposit Insurance Credit Corporation. जो पहले इस कॉर्पोरेशन का फंक्शनलिटी होती थी, वो क्या होता था कि लार्जली कोई भी इंडिविजुअल, अगर मान लो उसकी जो मनी है किसी शेड्यूल्ड कमर्शियल बैंक के साथ है, स्मॉल फाइनेंस बैंक के साथ है, कोऑपरेटिव बैंक के साथ है, पेमेंट बैंक के साथ है, और वो बैंक डिफॉल्ट कर गया, तो देयर इज अ प्रोविजन वेयर डिपॉजिटर्स मनी इज सेफगार्डेड. बट देयर इज अ लिमिट टू इट. लिमिट क्या था कि अब तक जो मैक्सिमम इंश्योरेंस विच कैन बी प्रोवाइडेड पर डिपॉजिटर्स एंड पर बैंक वाज 1 लाख रुपए, इररिस्पेक्टिव ऑफ आपने उस बैंक में कितना भी पैसे जमा किए. मान लो कि तुम्हारे 10 लाख रुपए SBI में जमा है तुम्हारे नाम से, पर डिपॉजिटर पर बैंक. दूसरे बैंक में है, दैट इज नॉट, आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट पर डिपॉजिटर पर बैंक. इफ द बैंक इज लिक्विडेटेड और बैंक डिफॉल्ट्स, सो मैक्सिमम सिक्योरिटी, मैक्सिमम इंश्योरेंस कितनी की प्रोवाइड होती थी? पहले 1 लाख. नाउ जब से 2-4 केसेस हुए लाइक PMC बैंक, समझ में, रूपी कोऑपरेटिव, सो गवर्नमेंट ने इस कवर को बढ़ाकर कितना कर दिया? 1 to 5 लाख. 1 to 5 लाख. सो मैक्सिमम आज के डेट में तुम्हारे मनी कितने भी हो किसी भी बैंक में, हाउ मच मनी इज योर इंश्योर्ड? 5 lakhs. Understood? So this law is applicable to any bank. It can be payment bank also, it can be private bank also, it can be scheduled commercial bank also, it can be cooperative bank also, it can be a small finance bank also. These provisions, this law is applicable to all the banks. Understood, all of you? So that is all about today. नेक्स्ट क्लास में हम लोग विल बी टॉकिंग अबाउट एग्रीकल्चर, इंडस्ट्री, सर्विसेज और सोशल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर.
Subscribe the Unique Academy's YouTube channel and press the bell icon for latest updates and videos.